Is there any of you who have an interest in soccer? And I'm talking about the European version of soccer, obviously, and not American football. Well, if you do, you might know some of the teams, and you might even have a favorite team. I know a lot of people around the world certainly have a favorite team. And I wouldn't say it's my favorite team, but one of the really successful teams in Europe is the Spanish club Real Madrid. They have been hugely successful and is considered one of the major soccer clubs that you'll find worldwide. What is actually interesting about Real is that if you go back to 2006, if you looked at all their players, they had some of the biggest stars in the world, highest paid and very successful. They were all on the team. They had a very loyal crowd of people and supporters that loyally met every weekend and supported the club. So there were 80,000 spectators in the stadium every weekend. And what was also very fascinating was that they had a huge amount of sponsors who just supported the club with millions and millions of euros. So everything on paper looked pretty good. There was only one thing that was not going that well, and that was the actually outcome of the things happening on the field. Because the team didn't really win a lot. They didn't qualify for the Spanish Cup, they didn't qualify for Champions League, they didn't actually do quite well. So the management of the club decided to fire who do you think? Obviously the trainer, is always the trainer, right? So they fired the trainer and hired an Italian gentleman by the name of Fabio Capello. Some of you might have heard that name. He's considered one of the best soccer coaches in Europe. So he was flown in and he was hired and he got an assignment. And the assignment was that in 1 year, he should manage to get the team to change and actually qualify for Champions League and the final in the Spanish League and so on and so forth. And you know what? He did that. 1 year later, the club has qualified to all the important tournaments and they were in the finals and things have started to turn around from a sporting point of view. But now something else happened, and that was a lot of the sponsors withdraw. They stopped their contracts, they didn't renew contracts, so the club started losing money because the sponsors were simply not pouring in millions of euros anymore. And every time they played, they couldn't even fill the stadium. So in the earlier games, you would have a stadium that was full of 70 to 80,000 people. Now they were down to 20, 25 or 30,000 people. And on top of that, a lot of the star players on the team started to be demotivated. They started to have injuries and they started to look if they could join another team somewhere else in Europe. Isn't that confusing? Because suddenly the team started to be successful. They started to qualify. They started to come and end up in the finals. And suddenly nobody really wanted to play for the team anymore. Nobody wanted to sponsor the team anymore. And nobody wanted to come and see the team play anymore. What do you think happened? I can tell you what happened. The team started to play a very boring version of soccer. So that means that the audience felt it was very boring. The sponsors could suddenly see that the audience wasn't that attracted anymore. And the players themselves felt that this was very sad and very boring. Why I'm sharing this story with you? I'm sharing this story because sometimes I meet unsuccessful negotiators who, by the way, believe they are successful, but they are unsuccessful because they're only focused on the outcome. Just like the team was in Spain. They were only focused on the result, but they forget the process. And what I'm just telling you right now is that a truly successful negotiator is obviously focused on the outcome. That is important when we negotiate, but he or she is just as focused on the process itself. That means how we're getting from A to B. So everything we are discussing when we are talking about our negotiation approach and strategy and tactics and everything is very focused on the process, because if we are good world champions on the process, we will definitely get world champions outcomes as well. I have a funny question to you, and this is actually a very serious study that has been conducted at a hospital in Denmark. And the question is, what do cocaine, amphetamine, gambling, sex, exercise, and a fantastic negotiation have in common? Well, you might know that the brain is producing a happy drug. And this happy drug, endorphins and other drugs, is actually making us feel comfortable and happy. And what researchers know, obviously, is why people get addicted to drugs is because they start feeling happy. That could be cocaine or amphetamine. The reason some people get addicted to gambling is for the same reason. They feel happy. When you have sex, that's the same thing that happens. You feel happy. When you exercise, you actually get a very good feeling as well. You feel happy because the release of that drug is just happening in the body. But what researchers has concluded in this hospital is actually that if you're conducting a negotiation that's gone really well, you're releasing the same amount of the happy drug as if you are conducting exercise, having sex, gambling, using illegal drugs like amphetamine or cocaine. So that means that conducting a real good negotiation will actually put you in a state of happiness as well. Now, obviously, that is required that it is a good negotiation. Otherwise, it may be a different kind of drug that you actually feel is released in your body. I'm sharing this with you because we need to understand that negotiation, just like all interaction with human beings, is an irrational process that is based on emotions and feelings. So that means that if we actually in a negotiation, it's a very emotional process. A very old study these days is actually conducted at UCLA, where they were looking at the total negotiation between human beings. And what this study actually claimed is that only 7% of the value is based on words. So only 7% of the reason that I believe in what you're saying is from the content of what you're saying. 38% of the reason I believe in what you're saying is your tone of voice, the variation, the speed, the pauses, and about 55% of the reason that I believe in what you're saying is coming from the body language. So imagine for a second that the value of the wording is only 7%. So could you imagine that I was standing here, presenting in front of you, and I was basically having no eye contact, I was looking down to the floor, and I might be mumbling. So I might be saying, I'm an international expert on negotiation and behavioral intelligence, and I'm very focused on trust as well. And I'm excited to be here today and talking to you. Now, if I did this in real life and you were sitting out there in the audience, you might be sitting there thinking, there's something wrong with that guy. I can't put my finger on it, but I don't really trust what he's saying. He claims he's an international expert in his field. He claims he's happy being here, but there's something wrong. And you know what's wrong? You're actually focusing more on my tone of voice and my body language than you are on what I'm saying. And my body language obviously was not focused on you. I didn't have eye contact. I had very low-hanging arms. My voice was low. I was mumbling a little bit. And when I said I was exciting to be here, I didn't show that in any possible way. So think about it. Obviously, the 7% of wording should never be zero because that has a value, but it only becomes a value the second that we feel comfortable with the tone of voice and the body language. When I'm sitting with my clients and we're preparing them for a negotiation, we are spending time on this model as well. To me, it's not really important whether it's 7% or 38 or 55, but it's just important for me to know that the majority of the reason that we become trustworthy is through our body language and our tone of voice. Now, if we go back to the old Greeks, they discovered a lot, they knew a lot even before we came into what we would call civilized times. And what they figured out is the ethos, the logos, and the pathos. And what they're basically claiming is that the emotional side, which is the pathos, represents 65% of the reason that we like somebody and we trust somebody. The logos is the fact, and that represents only 25% of the reason, and the credibility is the 10%. So the emotion is the biggest part, and the emotional thing where we actually enjoy somebody and like them and trust them is the 65. And the credibility is basically what they bring to the table through titles or history or background or education or whatever it might be. The dilemma of the negotiator, of the person sitting in a negotiation is very often emotional as well. And could you imagine that you're coming to a negotiation with me and I'm telling you that a couple of weeks ago I sent you a proposal, but that proposal is not valid anymore. We've actually increased all the prices by 18%. And the reason we've increased all the prices is because the oil have changed price, and when that is having an impact, that is having an impact on our product as well. So we were forced to increase all prices by 18%. And besides that, then our local management have ordered me to increase our prices by 3% on top of the oil price because we need to improve our profit. And if we don't get those additional 3%, we're going to pull out of the market and we're probably not going to be a potential supplier to you. And that's the way I'm opening this negotiation. And then I'm adding something else, and that is, and by the way, I only have 20 minutes to this very important negotiation. So I brought along the contract with the price increase of the 18 and the 3, and I brought a pen as well. So if you could please sign on the dotted line so we can move on, because I'm going to meet a really important client, Frankfurt in Germany. So let's just crack on signing this contract. Now, obviously, you get a little bit surprised here because you didn't know there was a price increase of 18%. You didn't know that my management would demand an improved profit line of 3%, and you didn't know I only had 20 minutes. You actually set aside 3 hours. So all this is absolutely news to you. But that is not the only thing. What is even worse is that you have a management that told you prior to this negotiation that this is a very important negotiation. And your manager told you that we expect you to bring home a signed contract. And if you don't bring home a signed contract, don't come home at all. Could you imagine sitting in this case? It might create a feeling of what, do you think? Well, it might create a feeling of stress. And if you become stressed in a negotiation, and you will, everybody do become stressed in a negotiation due to different things, you will either go into increased combative behavior or you will go into increased concession-oriented behavior. This is what we call the combat flight case. And this goes all the way back to our ancestors. Now, I'm a Dane, so obviously coming from Scandinavia, we had the Vikings going back about 1,000 years. And if you could imagine one of our ancestors 1,000 years ago, he was running in one of the big forests that was in Scandinavia in those days, and suddenly one day he met a representative of an enemy tribe. Could you imagine the two choices he had 1,000 years ago? He could either pull out his sword and start fighting, or he could drop everything he had and just run away. Okay, he could go into flight or fight mode. The same thing happens to the modern negotiator today when he or she will actually meet stress in a negotiation. So when we're talking about stress, we have negative emotions. And negative emotions could, for instance, be irritation. So that means if the counterpart is late at a meeting, if the counterpart doesn't show that they're listening to what they're saying, or if they're not responding to our questions, that could start irritate you as a negotiator. Another thing is that if we actually thought that we were just going to meet the counterpart one-on-one and they showed up being 5 people. If you ever tried that, you know that could be kind of uncomfortable. And on top of that, the counterpart might be in average older than us and have a higher ranking. They might be CEO or CFO or COO or whatever. And one of them actually have a higher level of technical knowledge, the expertise field in what we're going to talk about. And then we could add something else, and that is this whole negotiation is happening in Portuguese. So we have now added a lot of stuff that is just creating this unbalance. And we may not treat each other as equal people. We may use phrases like, if you didn't understand it the first time I explained to you, I can repeat it. How long time have you been in this business? It seems like you just started. Are you at all educated? You know, we can throw in comments like that. The personal chemistry is not working at all, and we don't understand each other's signal. So this obviously generates threats as well, or it could. So that means one side could be using battle, combative behavior. There could be a lot of tactical gambits, way to try and cheat and abuse the counterpart. There might be time pressure. And as psychologists are saying, one of our biggest threat in negative emotions could actually be our own fear of being perceived as a failure when we return to our organization. But we also got positive emotions. And positive emotion is that if things are working too easy and too well, and the expected problems that we expected, they didn't happen. It could also be that negotiations are easier than we expected. We might become naive, we lower our guard and jump to a conclusion, and we don't take the time to analyze and think. Imagine for a second you're invited to meet me at our headquarters and you step into our reception, and I run out immediately, shake your hand and say, thank you so much for coming here today. Now, before this meeting, you heard from all of your colleagues that this Mr. Jensen here is a nasty guy. He'll be terrible, aggressive. He'll be combative. He'll be criticizing your company, your service, your product, you as an individual, how you dress, where you live, your family, your kids, the car you drove, and everything else. So you are prepared for combat. And you arrive at this reception and you're really armed like a knight. So you can hear the sound when you're walking in, but you get completely surprised how friendly and open I am when I come out and shake your hand and I say, I'm so happy that you came here. When I heard that you're the representative of behalf of your company, I reached the conclusion that you and I are going to reach a mutual beneficial business result today. And I actually took the liberty of reserving a table at a 2-star Michelin restaurant this afternoon just to celebrate. I will pick up the bill because I'm certain we're going to sign a contract. And just before we sit down and start discussing the content, I prepared a small brunch table here. There are fresh greens, orange juice and apple juice and bread and cheese and bacon and whatever. If something is missing, just tell me and I'll get it for you. So once again, welcome so much to our company. Now you're standing there thinking, all my colleagues were absolutely wrong. This Mr. Jensen actually is a very nice guy. He's sure we're going to reach a mutual beneficial business result. He's inviting me to his 2-star Michelin restaurant and he'll be paying. And there's a full served brunch table right there. I think all my colleagues are wrong. Now, there's a risk here that you might be naive because, as I've been saying, you might be lowering your guard, you might be sharing too much information, and in both cases, regardless whether it is a negative or positive emotion, what you need to do is call for a break. Just like when you're watching a basketball game, the team that may be behind or feel there's some kind of pressure may call for a timeout, and we have to do the same thing in a negotiation. It's probably one of the more simpler tools I can offer you, that is simply ask for a break. And a break doesn't have to be an hour or a day. A break could be 4 minutes, where you just ask for permission to go to the restroom or call your office or whatever you need to do. Just stepping outside from the situation where you feel the confrontation and the stress can actually clear out the whole feeling of stress, and you can come back without going into combative or concession-orientated mode. So just to wrap up, look at this small picture here. That's basically 10,000s of years back in history. It's the same thing that has happened to a modern negotiator that happened to our ancestors. It's basically the fight or flight instinct. We become stressed. We actually feel that our life is in danger, and that is truly the feeling we are envisioning, or we are feeling as well when we're sitting at the negotiation table.